If you've watched my recent review of the Subaru Outback and you thought to yourself, that's a great idea, but I wish it had a little bit more luxury, an awful lot more performance, and perhaps a German logo on the front, that's where the new Mercedes-Benz E450 All-Terrain comes in. One thing that's odd is that there are a number of luxury off-road station wagons available, but none of them have had the success in the luxury segment that the Subaru Outback has had in the mainstream segment. The Outback is the only station wagon that outsells its sedan counterpart, and it outsells the Subaru Legacy by an absolutely enormous margin. Still, for some reason, many European luxury car companies are still very interested in the wagon format. Not only do we have this E450 All-Terrain, we also have the absolutely insane E63S. If you want 600 horsepower in your next station wagon, there's a Mercedes for that. We have the Audi Allroad, the A6 Allroad in the United States, and on-road and off-road editions of Volvo's V60 and V90 station wagons. The V90 is the one that would compete with this, of course, in cross-country form. In theory, the Outback and this E450 All-Terrain are designed exactly for my demographic. You see, I'm filming this video in my driveway, and connecting my gravel driveway to the paved road is a gravel road that is more than a mile long, and it is privately maintained. So sometimes in storms, as you'll see later in this video, there can be branches down all over the place. So the E450 All-Terrain gives us the practicality of the wagon format, which is a format that I have never particularly despised. I know a lot of people out there are really offended by the wagon format. I've never thought that it was a bad thing to look at, with the off-road potential of perhaps something along the lines of a Mercedes-Benz GLE, although it is notable that this does not have the ground clearance that we find in the GLE. However, we do have the family Mercedes look up front with some redesigned tweaks for 2021. We also have full LED headlights. These are definitely one of the better headlights that's available on the market. I really love the way that Mercedes does their high beam display. When the high beams turn on, it starts with an array that spreads out. It's really difficult to film, so rather unfortunately I don't have any footage of it in this video, but suffice to say, these are really, really cool high beams. For 2021 in the United States, the E-Class wagon is going to come in only two forms, this E450 4MATIC and the absolutely insane E63S. This is the off-road version, so compared to the previous E-Class wagon that was available in the US, we have a slight ride height increase. We also have the black body cladding at the bottom of the bumper and around the sides that you'll see in a bit. But the air ride suspension here does not take us as high as we find in the Audi Allroad or the V60 or V90 cross countries, and certainly not as high as the Subaru Outback. This wagon maxes out at just under 6 inches of ground clearance. You'll find over 8 inches of ground clearance in the Volvo and of course in the Subaru. Back when Mercedes first created the ML, the E-Class wagon outsold it, but that very rapidly changed, and now all of the Mercedes crossover lineup really outsells the E-Class wagon. Most people seem to prefer something that's a little bit more boxy, a little bit more upright, but in terms of general capability, the two vehicles are really not that far off. And this is almost exactly the same length as a Mercedes-Benz GLE, oddly enough. This is 194.8 inches long. This is within tenths of an inch of the Volvo V90, which is a hair shorter, and the Audi A6, which is a hair longer. Now, the cargo area in the back of an off-road wagon like this is definitely going to be a little bit smaller than something like the Mercedes-Benz GLE. Because the GLE is taller for the same length, we get more of a square cargo area in the back. In addition to the ground clearance not being quite as high as some of the competition, we also have pretty low-profile tires. These are 40 series 20-inch wheels and tires on this particular model. 19s are also available, but neither wheel is going to give you that much cushion. From the rear three-quarter view, this is instantly recognizable as a Mercedes wagon. This particular window shape and the entire profile of the side is definitely very recognizable. The E-Class wagon has long had a rear window that's been a little bit more raked than some of the Swedish competition, but the new V60 and V90 have gone in this similar direction as well. The result is we have wagons that are not quite as practical as they once were. As you'd expect out of an E-Class, we have full LED tail lamp modules, although the turn signal is red, which is certainly not my preference. And then we have dual exhaust tips down here at the bottom with a little bit of extra body cladding for the all-terrain version versus the European non-all-terrain version. As we see in the rest of their lineup, Mercedes goes about active safety a little bit differently than the Japanese competition, although it's worth noting that other than Subaru, there is no Japanese competition in this segment. So we don't have standard adaptive cruise control, but it is optional. The model that I'm driving has all of the systems on it, including the active parking assist system. Blind spot monitoring and autonomous braking are, however, standard. The long hood profile of the E-Class isn't here just because it looks good, although it certainly does. It's because we have a family of long engines under this hood. The base engine is the one that I'm taking a look at in the United States right now. It's a 3-liter turbocharged, mild hybridized inline 6. This produces 362 horsepower and 369 pound-feet of torque, and the engine is mated to a 21 horsepower electric motor, good for 184 pound-feet. The Mercedes EQ hybrid system is a little bit different than other mild hybrids on the market in the US right now, and the big difference is the air conditioning compressor. This has an electric air conditioning compressor, so even when the vehicle has the engine off at a stoplight, it will still run the air conditioning. It has a slightly larger lithium-ion battery pack in terms of capacity than most mild hybrids out there, and that really has a positive impact on real-world city fuel economy. This engine is mated to a 9-speed automatic transmission and standard all-wheel drive. Of course, if you want more oomph, there is the AMG version of this, and that will replace this engine with a twin-turbo V8, good for 603 horsepower, and absolutely positively insane 0 to 60 times, well under 4 seconds. At the moment, if you're looking for the fastest station wagon in America, that E63S is going to be the one for you. The E450 All-Terrain starts at $67,600. I'll talk about that later, but the model that I'm driving today has $20,000 of options on it. So as we take a look around, definitely keep that in mind. And because of some of the options that this vehicle has on it, I'm going to give these seats 10 out of 10 points. This has Mercedes' absolutely excellent E-Class massaging front seat. We have power extending thigh cushion, 4-way adjustable lumbar support, 3-position memory over there on the driver's door, and on the passenger's door because it has 3-position memory as well, and both seats have the same range of motion. These seats are heated and ventilated, and the heating can be coordinated with the massage profile in that MBUX infotainment system. If you're debating between something like this All-Terrain and a Mercedes-Benz GLE, keep in mind that versus something like the Subaru Outback, this is not quite as high off the ground, so this doesn't feel as crossover-like as you'll find in the Subaru Outback, even though the Outback has a seating position that is certainly very sedan-like. We also don't really find much of a change in terms of the roof profile here for the first row, so I have about half an inch of headroom left with the seat bottom cushion all the way to the ground. You will definitely find more headroom in those more upright Mercedes crossovers. Depending on the dimension that's important to you, you will probably also find a roomier back seat in something like the Mercedes-Benz GLE or the rest of the Mercedes crossover portfolio. Sitting right here behind myself, I have about 4 inches of legroom left, perhaps 5 if that front seat was a little bit further forward. I have a reasonable amount of headroom. I have about an inch of headroom back here, so definitely more than we find in the Mercedes-Benz E-Class sedan, even though we do have this large panoramic moonroof with a dual panel. One panel is right above my head here in the second row. But if you're looking for the most in second row headroom and especially third row room, then you might want to take a look at pretty much any of the Mercedes competition. Even something like the Mercedes-Benz GLB with its available third row is going to be a little bit more comfortable in the way back than this E-Class wagon. However, if I move over here to the middle seat, I still have a reasonable amount of headroom. Things go down to maybe about 3/4 of an inch here. And if I scoot all the way over to the right side of the vehicle, the footwell is a little bit tight, but this front seat's all the way back in its tracks, and I still have about an inch of legroom left. Legroom in here is very comparable to the Volvo V90 and the Audi A6. The A6 is a little bit roomier overall, but the big reason that the V90 is in this category is that it does not get the same wheelbase stretch as the Volvo S90 does. So if you're taking a look at the S90 versus the Mercedes-Benz E-Class, the Volvo is quite a bit longer, but when it comes to the wagons, they're almost exactly the same size. As we dive behind this hatch, you need to know that there are a number of different ways of measuring cargo capacity, and when you take a look at the spec sheet for this Mercedes, it seems like it has an absolutely enormous cargo area at 35 cubic feet. However, if you take a look at the European specification and then calculate from liters back to cubic feet, this comes in at 24 cubic feet, which I think is a little bit more close to what you can realistically put in this cargo area. Because in my 24-inch roller bag test, this accommodated the exact same number of bags as the A6, the V90, and the Outback, which are all also right around 24 to 25 cubic feet. It's worth noting that the cargo area, oddly enough, in the V60 is a little bit smaller than this, but it was still able to squeeze 5 of those 24-inch roller bags inside. If you're willing to pile your cargo a little bit higher, you will be able to fit more bags in something like the Mercedes-Benz GLE or obviously the GLS, but they would have to go above the height of the second row headrests. So depending on exactly how you're packaging your vehicle, cargo capacity realistically could be somewhat similar to the GLE, although keep in mind if you're going to try and put a big barbecue in the vehicle, it may fit a little bit better in the GLE because of the cargo area height. But cargo practicality isn't just about putting things behind the hatch, it's also about loading things on the roof. And one of the distinct advantages to this format of vehicle versus a traditional boxy crossover is that the roof line is an awful lot closer to the ground. So if you're the kind of person that routinely puts bicycles or kayaks or skis or that sort of thing on top of your vehicle, it's a lot easier to load in something like this or the Allroad or the V90 than something like a Mercedes-Benz GLE or an XC90. And this is especially true if you're a shorter person. So if you're, say, 5'6" or 5'8", something like that, this is going to be an awful lot easier to load than some of those larger and taller SUVs. And if you're a taller person, it's just going to be quite a cinch to put things right up there on top. If you're my age or older, you may have some fond memories of riding in the backwards-facing third row of a station wagon. And the E-Class continues on that tradition with really the only station wagon rear-facing third row available in North America. This is something that we used to find in a wide range of station wagons and Volvos not that long ago, but Volvo has ditched this option for North America. Unlike those 1970s station wagons, however, this third row is incredibly compact because this is a much smaller vehicle than the Country Squire that you might be remembering. But I still am going to have to give this 10 out of 10 points in my trunk comfort index because really, this is the only cargo area in a station wagon that has available seatbelts. Now you do have to unbuckle your seatbelt in order to close the hatch. It is powered and there is a hatch release right back in here for the rear passengers. Just in case you were wondering, I can just press that button and then open the hatch. Going in for a closer look, you can really see how teeny tiny these third row seats are, and that seat bottom cushion is very thin and it is very, very close to the ground. We don't have a spare tire in the E450. If we twiddle this little knob and then pull this up, this is where we find the 12-volt battery. I kind of wish that Mercedes has put this somewhere differently, so that way they could have given this third row just a tiny bit more room, or of course a bit more cargo capacity. Here's how the thing folds. We simply lift this section up, fold it down, then we make sure the seat belts are tucked in there. We push down the headrests and flip them forward, right like that, right like that, and then that drops into place. A bit more useful for most families out there is the 40-20-40 folding rear seat design. For some reason, the Germans and the Swedes spend way more time thinking about cargo practicality, especially in their station wagons, than pretty much anybody else out there. For instance, back here behind the second row, we have this really interesting combination unit. It has a roller-style tonneau cover, just as you'd expect in a station wagon or a crossover. We also have this pop-up cargo divider, which we see in some of the other station wagons out there. So you can keep your cargo from flying forward, or if you have a dog in the back, you can make sure that Fluffy is right back here where he's supposed to be. But you can also remove this unit, latch it into place on the back of the second row seats, and then there are some different attachment points right here just behind the first row seats. So that even if the second row is folded, you can keep your cargo in place, or again, keep your animals where they're supposed to be. Of course, if you have a particularly crafty or small pet, they'll always be able to go around this divider. As we look around this interior, keep in mind that this particular model does have, again, almost $20,000 worth of options on it. So we have the dual pane moonroof right here, one pane pretty large over the driver and front passengers' heads, and then a smaller one back there for the second row passengers. We have well integrated sunshades in the second row doors. We also have four-way adjustable headrests with the addition of this butterfly functionality right here. They're height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, and this model does have optional leather upholstery. As we see in the rest of the Mercedes lineup, there's a reasonable amount of interior customizations. There are a lot of different upholstery choices. This one does have one of the upper level leather options. This also has the available massage, the extending thigh cushion, four-way lumbar support, etc. The controls for pretty much everything except for the four-way lumbar happen right up here on the door. We have a ton of real wood trim. I actually like the wood trim in this model a little bit more than what we see in the Volvo or in the Audi, but I was surprised that the color of these two sections of trim don't quite match. The one on the doors, both doors, is a little bit darker than what we find on the dashboard. But when it comes to the interior style and interior design, I think that this is my favorite in this relatively small luxury station wagon segment, although you will have to pay for it because this is significantly more expensive than the Volvo options. You can see that this interior also has a lot of ambient lighting going on. There's that ambient lighting strip you can see right there under the wood trim on the door. There's also one under the infotainment system right here, and there are a ton of different modes you can choose from. You can even choose a color wheel mode, so it will cycle through various colors. The controls should be pretty familiar if you've seen any of Mercedes' latest vehicles. You can see that we have a lot of round air vents, open and closed dials right there on the dashboard. I like this look. It reminds me an awful lot of a very expensive aircraft. Moving over to the middle of the dashboard, we have the typical large Mercedes dual screen setup here, where we have a large infotainment screen and then a large LCD instrument cluster behind the steering wheel. But as we see in other Mercedes models, CarPlay does not occupy the entire screen. That's mainly, I think, because of the position of the steering wheel and the closeness of these two screens together. So this portion of the screen right here that is blank on this side really can't be seen by the driver because of the steering wheel. You have to lean over a little bit if you want to see it. Working our way down there, we again have those 4 large air vents, more of that ambient lighting, the controls for the infotainment system, as well as the climate control system. So we have some direct access buttons down there for that infotainment system, toggle switches for the climate control, and then this takes us over to the climate control menu so you can control the third zone a little bit more easily. We then have a large wood cover there over a wireless charging mat, USB input, and this is just about large enough for some of those larger smartphones, although the cable could get a little tangled if you were using those cup holders right there. They are pretty large cup holders, so you should have absolutely no problem putting some of those larger takeout drinks in there. And then we have some of the drivetrain controls down here. We have the drive mode toggle. This allows us to choose between Eco, Comfort, Sport, Sport Plus, and of course, because this is an off-road vehicle, we also have Off-Road and Off-Road Plus. Off-Road Plus puts this into the highest height mode, but the speed is going to be limited in that mode to about 22 miles an hour, otherwise the vehicle will start lowering itself. We then have a button to manually engage or disengage the high height mode. We don't have quite as much control over the air suspension as we see in some of Mercedes' other vehicles. This is a button for the autonomous parking and camera system. There's a button to engage and disengage the auto start-stop system, fold the rear headrests, and then the rest of the infotainment controls. As with other Mercedes vehicles, there are 3 ways of controlling the infotainment system. We have this touchpad here, which is my least favorite method of interacting with the system. Then we have a full touchscreen, so everything in the system can be accessed by touching the screen itself. And then we have some touch controls over here on the steering wheel that we'll see in a little bit. Between the driver and front passenger, we have a padded armrest that opens in a bifold fashion there. It's not terribly large, but we do have some additional USB ports inside. This model has one of Mercedes' latest heads-up displays. It is very configurable. We have these 3 different quadrants, and you use controls on the steering wheel to toggle through the options. So we have 3 different options right over here for the center. We have a number of different options available for each side, and then you control it via the buttons on the steering wheel. You can also turn it off and adjust its height and brightness, of course. Now, rather unfortunately, heads-up displays are notoriously difficult to film, so to the human eye, this display is an awful lot crisper, and it doesn't flicker, of course, as you see on camera. As with the heads-up display, we have a high degree of customization available with these displays. You can cycle through a bunch of different looks, layouts, moving map displays, etc. And you can choose a wide variety of different themes for this LCD generally. Although it's worth noting that none of them will have the Google satellite imagery that we do find available in the Audi A6. On the right side of the wheel, we find touch buttons for the infotainment system. This is the controller for that infotainment screen itself. It acts basically like the touchpad in the center console. And then we find a very similar control over here on the left side for the instrument cluster, along with the controls for the adaptive cruise control system. On the back of the wheel, we have paddle shifters up on the right and then down on the left. Now, my complaint about touch controls like this is that they can get confused and they can fail to respond to really dry hands. So if you have dry hands like I do, it can be more difficult to use these than physical buttons like we saw in the previous generation of the Mercedes steering wheel. And I have to say that this touch controller here is a little bit more difficult to use than the touch controller that we found in the previous generation as well. It doesn't respond as smoothly to inputs, and sometimes I find myself having to press a little bit harder. At that point, you accidentally click in and it clicks an option. I just found these a little bit less reliable and less easy to use than what we had before. When creating the E450 All-Terrain from the E450, the transfiguration arguably is not as complete as the transfiguration that we find in some of the competition. Ride height was increased a little bit, but overall this feels an awful lot like the regular E450. When Mercedes announced that aside from the E63, all versions of the E-Class wagon would be the all-terrain version in the US, I know a number of Mercedes fans that were absolutely beside themselves. They thought that they had absolutely destroyed the E-Class wagon. But to be perfectly honest, this feels very much like the E-Class wagon from before. That's because the modifications to turn this into the all-terrain are arguably not as complete as the alterations that we see in, say, the Audi A6 or the Volvo V90 Cross Country. The suspension system is largely the same because the ride height has not been altered that much. 5.8 inches of ground clearance is a little on the high side for a sedan or a wagon, but that's not enormously high versus something like the regular V90 or, in Europe, the regular Audi A6. And as such, this feels just like a regular E-Class wagon with a little bit of extra ride height. And it certainly performs like a regular E-Class wagon as well. 0 to 60 in this model happened in 4.9 seconds. That is definitely faster than the Volvo Wagon lineup. And 60 to 0 braking distances were short as well, 114 feet. You can thank the large brakes that we have on this model. These are really large brakes and very grippy tires. Now, on the downside, the E-Class Wagon is a little bit heavier than I had expected. The Volvo Wagon is several hundred pounds lighter. And that's why I was surprised that this doesn't feel quite as nimble as the V90 Wagon can, depending on the road surface that you're on. Now, very clearly, the V90 has a front power bias. It has more weight on the front axle as well, versus what we find in this E-Class Wagon. This is going to have a bit more of a rear drive dynamic, but there are times where that V90 can feel a little bit lighter and a little bit more nimble, and that's due to the weight. The weight of the Audi A6 is very comparable to what we see here in the E450. Now that said, I'm absolutely going to give handling an A because the E-Class Wagon has a great feel to it. You'll notice that whether you're out on the highway, out on your favorite winding mountain road, or whether you're out on a truly poorly paved road surface like the one that I'm on here. Lower profile tires like this provide an awful lot less cushion and less rim protection as well. So if you're worried about damaging a rim, bending a rim, cracking a rim, that is much more likely when you have lower profile tires like this on a vehicle. So theoretically, much more likely in this than in some of the alternatives. But on the other hand, the lower profile tires really help out the handling ability. And Mercedes has done an excellent job of trying to balance these priorities, and you can really thank the adaptive air suspension for that. And that's why this delivers excellent ride quality and excellent handling ability, even out on rougher road surfaces like we're on here. Just keep in mind, the likelihood of getting one of those tires or wheels damaged is going to be higher, and we have no spare tire in the E450 All-Terrain. This instead uses run-flat tires. In terms of ride quality, the air suspension that we find in the E450 and in the A6 Allroad really separate these two German entries from the two Swedish entries. The V60 and V90 do not have an available air suspension, although the V90 does have a partial air suspension, which is a little bit of an interesting twist. It has an air rear axle and then a regular adaptive front axle. The adaptive air suspension that we find in the E450 All-Terrain and the A6 Allroad separate these vehicles from the V60 and V90 in the luxury segment because the cross-country variants of the Volvo wagons don't have full four-corner air suspensions. Although it is worth noting again that the ground clearance that we find in this all-terrain model, even in its highest height setting, which I am now in, is not as high as what we find in the V90 cross-country. So arguably the V90 doesn't need the airlift suspension because it's already higher off the ground, and of course the Subaru Outback is higher than all of these together. When it comes to ride quality, the E450 is absolutely tops in this segment. I prefer the ride quality in this to the A6 Allroad, which is definitely excellent as it is, and I prefer both of these to the V90 Cross Country. The V90 Cross Country comes across as a little bit firm, especially in the upper end trims. So if you really were driving on rougher roads all the time and you wanted the most comfortable ride, you'd want to take a look at the Mercedes or the Audi. On the other hand, if you want something that's a little bit firmer, then you might want to take a look at the Volvo. Because even in its firmest mode, this suspension is actually not going to be quite as firm as some of those alternatives. In my cabin noise testing, I measured 71 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour, making this one of the quietest station wagons you can buy in North America. Interestingly enough, however, there are going to be some crossovers that are a little bit quieter than this in the luxury segment. For instance, the BMW X5 is a little bit quieter inside than this E450. Logically, the wagon variant of the E-Class is going to be a little bit louder because that cargo area is open to the passenger area. So if you're looking for the absolute quietest E-Class, that's probably going to be the sedan. Thanks to the mild hybrid system that is standard, this E-Class wagon has delivered impressive fuel economy. Even though the EPA fuel economy average is 22 mpg, I've been averaging 24.5 miles per gallon. That puts this an awful lot closer to the four-cylinder competition. That's because this integrated starter motor generator unit can also drive the vehicle in electric-only mode at very low speeds. So in stop-and-go and slow-and-go traffic situations, the kind of things that you'd find yourself in on your daily commute, this is going to be an awful lot more efficient than a simple start-stop system because it does a little bit more than simply start and stop the engine. And as I said before, it also allows the air conditioning system to operate when the vehicle is at a complete stop. And that means that if you live in a hotter climate, say you're in the south and it's 100 degrees outside, this vehicle can stop at that stoplight and you're much less likely to press that auto start stop disable button because the air conditioning is going to stay on. And then when you start off again, because the electric motor produces a reasonably healthy amount of torque, nearly 200 pound-feet of torque, you don't feel the need to disable that system to get that peppy start again because the electric motor can really kick in, deliver that instant torque, and then of course wait for the engine and turbocharger to spool up. Bottom line, out on the road, the E450 is sort of the jack of all trades. It has a great engine note, it has excellent acceleration, excellent handling ability, and a very plush ride as well, with a little bit of an increase in terms of off-road capability. Now, if you're after the most in off-road capability, you should take a look at something else, because the ground clearance is just going to be a little too low in this versus some of those key competitors. On the other hand, if you're looking for an off-road wagon with the absolute pinnacle of refinement, unquestionably, that's the E-Class. For 2021, the E450 All-Terrain is one of the more expensive wagons in America. It's going to start at $67,600, and if you get carried away with options, which is pretty easy, you can go all the way up to about $95,000. That's before we even talk about port or dealer-installed accessories. Clearly, that puts the E450 in a different category than the rest of the European luxury off-road wagons. But let's roll through the competition here anyway. The first one, and I think in a way perhaps the most direct competitor, is the Audi A6 All-Road. It starts at $65,900 and will go up to about $85,000 just about if you get carried away with options. Obviously, there are fewer options available in that Audi A6 than we find in the Mercedes-Benz E450. There are a few reasons I think the All-Road is a bit more of a direct competitor to the Mercedes. Obviously, they're both German, and that does play into some people's minds, but also the Audi has a full four-corner air suspension like we find in the E450. That's something that we don't get in the Volvo option. And the Audi is a little bit more powerful than the Volvo as well. 335 horsepower, 396 pound-feet of torque, and it also has a mild hybrid 48-volt system like we find in the Mercedes. One of the key differences between drivetrains in these vehicles is that the Audi does use their excellent DCT rather than a traditional automatic transmission. Now, some folks may not like a dual clutch transmission, especially if you do plan on taking your vehicle mildly off-road. Keep in mind, DCTs don't have a torque converter, so they're not going to behave quite like an automatic if you're climbing steeper slopes or up small rocks, things like that, and you want to go at really low speeds. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to maintain those speeds in a dual clutch transmission. And overheating and wear of that DCT may be a bit more of a concern. Also keep in mind that Audi's DCTs have a shorter maintenance cycle than most of the automatic transmissions in the luxury segment. Depending on the vehicle you're talking about, transmission fluid changes should happen right around 45,000 miles or so. Comparably equipped, the Audi A6 All-Road is going to be a little bit less expensive than the Mercedes All-Terrain, and that goes for the base model all the way up to about that $85,000 mark. Now, there are a decent number of options and features available in the Mercedes and a level of customization in the Mercedes that you do not find in the Audi A6 All-Road. We have more leather colors to choose from, more wood options to choose from, and some really attractive interior combinations in the Mercedes, whereas the Audi tends to be a little bit more off the shelf. There aren't quite as many combinations that you can choose from. Of course, you will pay for that level of customization because any way you slice it, the Mercedes is going to be a bit more expensive. The Audi A6 is a solid option if you want a bit more ground clearance. It has an adaptive air suspension like the Mercedes, but it goes up to about 7.3 inches, which is above what we find in the E450. Now again, I find the E450's suspension height numbers a little bit confusing, and I suspect that in the real world it has a bit more than Mercedes is quoting on their spec sheet because the European spec sheets imply that there is a bit more ground clearance, but I'm just going with what Mercedes has on their spec sheet at this time. Next up, we have the value option, and oddly enough, one of the best-selling wagons in North America. Now, that's not saying too much because outside the Subaru Outback, all station wagons don't really sell well compared to their sedan counterparts. But the Volvo is the least expensive, and it's one of the few that has a traditional wagon format. So if you want the V90, that's $52,495, front-wheel drive, 250 horsepower in that model. If you want the off-road version, that's the Cross Country, and it bumps the price tag up to $55,595, and it brings you 316 horsepower and standard all-wheel drive. That has a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged and supercharged engine. The power figures are pretty healthy, but 0 to 60 acceleration times are certainly going to be behind the E450 or the A6 All-Road. Definitely nothing to sneeze at, but keep in mind it is going to be a little bit slower. However, the Volvo is always going to be less expensive. It will top out at around $71,000, excluding accessories that are installed by the dealer, so as you can see, significantly less expensive than the Audi or the Mercedes. Volvo went in a slightly different direction with this generation of the V90. Even though they have full adaptive air suspensions in their lineup, you'll find those in the XC60 and XC90, the design of the V90 and S90 sedan and wagon series was not really designed to accommodate an airbag on the front suspension. So the V90 has a 4-corner adaptive suspension, but only the rear axle gets the airbags. The rear suspension in the V90 load levels, but it will never be able to raise the entire vehicle up and down like we find in the Mercedes or the Audi. Now, arguably it doesn't need to because it has the most ground clearance in this segment at 8.3 inches. If you're taking a look at the regular wagon, that's 6 inches, which is pretty similar to the Mercedes All-Terrain. even though that is just the regular Volvo wagon, and the Audi splits the difference here at around 7.3 inches maximum. Keep in mind that if you have the Mercedes or the Audi in their max height suspension modes, then you're limited to just over 20 miles an hour, and if you exceed that speed, the vehicle will end up lowering itself. And obviously that's not what we see in the Volvo, because it's always going to be up there at 8.3 inches. If you're looking for the ultimate luxury off-road wagon, absolutely, that is going to be the Mercedes wagon. And if you're looking for the absolutely most insane station wagon available in America, unquestionably, that would be the E63 S-Wagon. That is an absolute hoot and a half. Hopefully I'll be able to spend more time behind the wheel of that wagon. I've only briefly been able to drive it, but hopefully Mercedes will send me one at some point. When it comes to cargo practicality, as I discussed, all three of these wagons are really quite similar. The Mercedes wagon has kind of an unusual cargo figure there. I don't know if I quite believe it, because we were able to put the same number of roller bags in all three of these cargo areas. So when it comes to cargo practicality, honestly, all three of them are pretty equal. If my own money were on the line, I would aspire to own the Mercedes wagon, but I would probably buy the Volvo wagon because it's simply less expensive. Even if you get carried away with options, that fully loaded V90 cross-country wagon is only going to be marginally more expensive than an absolutely base Mercedes E450. Let me know what you would buy if you were shopping in this segment, and would you be even considering a wagon like this at all? Because keep in mind that something like the Mercedes-Benz GLE is going to be a little bit less expensive than the E450 All-Terrain. That does make the E450 a little bit difficult to justify, because honestly the GLE is a little bit more cargo practical. I find the interior just a tiny bit more comfortable depending on exactly which option you get, and you aren't giving up any of the luxury features and amenities in that GLE versus the E-Class wagon. There was a time where the Mercedes-Benz sedans seemed a little bit more premium inside and outside than the Mercedes-Benz crossovers, but that simply isn't the case anymore. Mercedes really has achieved parity in terms of interior refinement, driving refinement, and in some instances even handling between their vehicles, their crossover vehicles and their sedans and wagons in their lineup. So keep in mind that a Mercedes-Benz GLE, depending on exactly the options that you select, may even outhandle the E450 wagon. With all that out of the way, let me know what you would shop down there in the comments section below. Be sure and check out the merch store at aoamerch.com. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautis so you can see what I'm driving this week, and I'll see all of you later.